Hey, welcome to Flipping Over Rocks, a podcast series aimed at uncovering the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and creativity. I'm Tony Lyons, and I've spent 30 years in brand marketing trying to find creative solutions to difficult marketing challenges, with some success and some, let's call it, less successful ventures. I've flipped over a lot of rocks. So I decided to try to unpack how creativity is influenced at the most biological level by speaking with neuroscientists, educators, and psychologists. It's time to get curious. My guest today is Zul Merali. Zul has over 40 years' experience in the field of neuroscience and mental health. He's published over 250 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He's the former CEO of the University of Ottawa Institute of Mental Health Research at the Royal, and currently is the founding director of the Brain and Mind Institute at the Aga Khan University. So how's it going with the setting up your Brain and Mind Institute? What's the latest?
Well, it's coming along really well. I think that the challenge with the Aga Khan University is that it has campuses in 6 different countries right now, and the main hubs are in Karachi for Pakistan and related areas in South Asia, and in Kenya for the East African countries. And it really very different geographies and serving low and medium economic countries. And so it comes with its own challenges and its own kind of needs and gaps. So I've been spending a lot of time understanding the landscape better and looking at the tapestry of expertise across the different domains at the university. And right now, as we speak, we're in the process of bringing all the information together and creating an integrated framework for the university for mental health and neuroscience. So that's where we're at right now. It's and of course the biggest challenge is right now recruiting talent, and so we're building capacity in those countries by identifying the gap areas and bringing in scientists with experience in those domains. And so that's the fun part. That's what we're in the middle of, the activities that we're doing right now. And of course, it also comes along with the development of the infrastructure. So we're building a building. The building is up already. We're fitting it up to meet the needs of the brain and mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a Brain and Mind Institute, and that's interesting to me. The idea of the mind, that notion of consciousness and sense of self, and then the brain is essentially an organ that is the machine that runs that. Is that really what neuroscience is all about? Is the intersection of the physiology and the emotional? Like when we talk about neuroscience, and in popular culture, I think, including myself, we bandy that term around like we know what we're talking about, and of course we have no clue. Yeah. So what is the practice of neuroscience? Because my understanding is it's a fairly new scientific field, right?
It is new in a way. It's new in the sense that we are beginning to understand a brain a lot better. Neuroscience itself is a very interdisciplinary science. It works very closely with other disciplines. So, for example, it works closely with mathematics, linguistics, engineering, computer science, chemistry, philosophy, psychology, medicine. These are just some of the key areas that inform neuroscience. So neuroscience is really a networking construct that looks at a focus on the nervous system. And in essence, because the nervous system impacts the whole body and the mind, it's very quite encompassing. And so that is the area of neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the field of medicine at large obviously has been developing over thousands of years, really. I mean, right. Western medicine is a little younger than that, but in Asia and India, and the idea of medicine and how interventions can impact health is as old as civilization, right? In some ways.
Yeah.
So, but yet we still don't really fully understand the most important organ in our bodies, the
Right.
brain.
Right.
And I've heard it described as being, and this is obviously, a very, what's the word? Well, it shows our human frailty because it's been described as the most complex organism in the universe is the human brain. Of course, it's probably not, but right now we think it is.
It
Yeah.
is.
So I mean, why? This is kind of a dumb question, but why is it so complicated to figure it out? Like,
All right. Okay. So let's put it in numbers. Okay. So you're looking at a very compact mass of tissue. You're talking only about 3 pounds encased in your skull, right? 3 pounds. But what's in those 3 pounds of the brain are neurons. These are the building blocks, the cells that make up the nervous system. And there are 100 billion of those neurons in that little space. And then the way the brain works is actually a network. It's an interaction between different nerve cells, and the nerve cells talk to each other, and they talk to each other through connections called synapses. And those connections in the brain, there are 100 trillion connections. 100 trillion. That's more than, if you look at up in the sky, all the galaxies and all the stars don't amount to it. So it is so it's a highly complex, intricate organ that is really tied in a very small space. And so it's considered to be one of the most complex organisms in the universe right now.
And when we hear people try to break it down in terms of in an overly simplistic way, I think people talk about things like left brain thinking, right brain thinking.
Right.
They talk about primal brain versus new brain. And we're sort of trying to interpret, I think we're trying to interpret how we exist in ourselves, and why people are different, like why some people act certain ways. I think so. Breaking it down just in its very basic, components. What about this idea of left versus right brain?
So, well, the left and the right brains. So, if you open up a brain and put it on a table, it looks like a walnut, right? And just like a walnut, there's a big fissure in the middle. So there's one lobe on one side, another lobe on the other side. And then there's the left and the right lobes. And in essence, in a nutshell, the way those lobes function are different. They are different in the sense that the left side is more specialized in thinking in words, in sequencing, linear thinking, essentially, kind of more mathematically inclined, more facts, more logically oriented. And the right side is more sort of a more imaginative side of the brain, more intuition, more rhythm, interpretations, holistic thinking, more artsy, more arts-based. But I mean, that's some of the functional organization of the brain and the way it works. But this left brain, right brain phenomenon, I mean, although there are these differences, what's most important to realize is that this left and the right brain are connected through a huge wiring network, which is called corpus callosum. So that is the bridge that connects the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And what's very unique about the brain is that it's really all traffic flow. It's the interconnectedness between the different regions. So even though there might be specialized activities and functionings going on in the brain, it really functions as a unified organ. Mm-hmm. Even if you were to slice the brain, if you were to cut the corpus callosum, which was done in the olden days when you were treating epilepsy, because, epilepsy, when it happens, it triggers from one part of the brain and then eventually engulfs the entire body, because it transmits the electrical activity through the entire brain. To stop it, early surgeons used to cut the corpus callosum, and it shed
Like physically open up somebody's head and cut that thing.
Yeah, cut the connection.
Okay.
So that it would keep the electrical storm from going from one part of the brain to the other. And so, because one hemisphere normally connects motors for motor function, one half of the body, then that way they thought that you could maintain control by keeping the storm from generalizing to the whole brain. So that was the original thinking, and they were cutting the corpus callosum. And they had to do some pretty intricate testing to see the functional differences when that connectivity was severed, because the brain is very intelligent. I mean, it can pick up information, be it directly through this interconnectedness or through other sensory input. So you can see and you can hear and you can smell and you can listen through both sides of the brain. And so each one knows what's going on, and it works in an integrated organ single way. So this issue of left brain versus right brain in terms of personality traits and stuff like that, there's no evidence for it. Right. If you look at the activity patterns in the brain, the left and the right are both equally engaged in most of the time in individuals.
Yeah, because I always feel like we try to pigeonhole people. Like when we think about creativity, I think, people go, oh, they're a right brain thinker because the creativity is, invention and visioning and, future state ideas and holistic thinking and all the rest of it. But I mean, at the end of the day, like you said, it really isn't. There might be areas that of the brain that impact certain behaviors, but it is one thing.
Right.
And I don't. There is no evidence, and I think you corroborate this, to say that a creative person's right side of their brain is more developed than the left side of their brain. So that must come. I mean, I think it must come from there's obviously a genetic impact. Like some people are, naturally a certain way, but I mean the impact of someone's environment must have something to do with that too. I mean, in terms of people who are, considered creative versus people who would be considered not creative. I personally believe that everybody is creative. I think it's a fundamental trait of human beings to be creative. That's just who we are. That's why we're successful as a species, because we are creative. So I've heard you talk about this before, that that whole other fallacy of nature versus nurture, and you just shake your head when you hear that, and you use a rectangle analogy.
Yes. So that rectangle analogy actually comes from, I kind of give my age away when I say that. Well, one of my old professors at McGill, when I was an undergraduate, was Don Hebb. Donald Hebb is probably one of the most famous neuroscientists, a psychologist, and he was telling me that in one of his lectures, you were kind of sharing that, and I was stuck in my mind, and he said one of the reporters asked him from the Montreal Star, and he says, "Sir," he says, "what is more important? Is it nature or is it nurture?" And his answer was, he says, it's like asking me what is more important to the area of a rectangle. Is it the height or the width? He says it is really a composite score of the two. It's not either or. And that is very true. And I think that the more and more we're learning about how the interconnectedness between those two aspects. And it brings me to the thinking of the indigenous people. Very often indigenous people don't tend to differentiate it as much, and they think like you, it's not you and the environment. You are the environment.
Right.
You are the part of the environment. It's not you or the environment. You are one and the same. And so, we're sort of, they are much more holistic in integrating the nature versus personal aspects of whole beings.
Yeah.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense, actually.
Right. I read a book a while ago called "Thinking Fast and Slow" by a researcher named Daniel Kahneman. And it's really interesting. It's a bit of a heavy read, to be honest, for a guy like me, but it was worth it. And he talks about two systems in the brain, essentially the fast decision-making system and the slow, more cognitive system. And it comes down to the primal instinctual versus the newer brain.
Right.
So as a neuroscience and scientist, and you've looked at the scans and looked at the activities and all the rest of it. So again, to a layperson, left brain versus right brain, old brain versus new brain, and you're kind of thinking, well, is it all just like chunks of stuff bolted together up there? It's all one thing firing in one neural network, right? So, so what about this idea of primal brain versus new brain?
And I guess developmentally, that makes a lot of sense in the sense that even when you see the development of young people, for example, I remember as a youngster doing some foolhardy things that when I look back and I tell myself, what were you thinking? What were you thinking? And the thing is, the point is, I was not thinking. I was more reacting to the aspect of my neural development at that point in time that was more driven by the visceral, by the more called reptilian side of the brain. The cortex, as we grow, the cortex it keeps on growing, and that is the last part of the brain that stops growing when you're an adult. But as it is growing, this new piece of the brain, which is the cortex, has taken on many different functions, and it is kind of almost brings a sober second thought to your thinking process. And
it's like the Senate. It's like the
Exactly.
Senate of your mind.
Yes. So you will, you have a tendency to react to certain type of event or situation, but you might not react immediately to it, as the cortex will process the information and say, just a second, like think through of all the consequences and not just how you're feeling at this moment. And so both in terms of the development and in terms of behaviors, there is this definite dichotomy that gets more and more integrated, but it is there. It's based on reality in terms of the development of the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's particularly salient to us as marketers and brand communicators and advertisers, because really what we're trying to do is to create messages and experiences that influence behavior, like influence a decision. So, I mean, I've been doing this job for over 30 years, and I've done campaigns that have been successful. They've made people do things, and we've worked on some of them are together actually at the Royal. Yeah. And I've done other campaigns that haven't achieved anything. And I at the time I thought I was creating a good story that would inspire somebody, and it just didn't work. And trying to unpack why those things work
is very interesting, because I think that one of the lessons learned for me was that when I was thinking about marketing and thinking about economics, because one of the arguments that I was bringing into play when I was running the Royal Institute of Mental Health Research was that being a scientist, I used to say, just look at the facts. At one point, facts were king for me. Mm-hmm. And I would say, just look at the facts. Like mental illnesses carry the largest burden of illness. And we as a society spend less than 5% of our dollars on an illness that costs the most, and that takes the biggest toll. So what is there to discuss? Let's just turn the situation around. But it's more easily said than done. I was having difficulty because of stigma and many other things to get people engaged. And I had a conversation with Mark Carney, who was then running the Bank of Canada. And I was shocked. Like, I mean, Mark, I gave him my spiel to Mark, and he says, I get it. I understand fully. And then he told me, he says, but you know what? He says, it's very facts oriented, what you're telling me, this story.
Which is hilarious. The governor of the Bank of Canada is,
from the Bank.
I don't want your statistics.
and he says to me that what I should have been telling him. He tells me that you need to have an emotional hook. You need to have an emotional hook, because if you don't have the emotional buy-in, then you won't get the results that you want.
Yeah.
And so wise words, because I think that's exactly what is driving the world a lot these days. I mean, the disastrous American elections was a core example of how people kind of ignore the facts when they want to, and because it's meeting their visceral drives and needs and constructs, and those become very important in the decision making at the end of the day.
Yeah, I've tried to break it down, into sort of understandable chunks that, when we worked with the team here to develop a story or an idea for a brand or a marketing campaign, like to have a process that we follow that will hopefully inspire and drive behavior. And so we've come up with is this sort of a matrix of three drivers of decision making, and we call it trust, love, and logic. And where it comes from is the idea of familiarity. So trust is either name recognition, or it could be interpersonal relationships, or third-party endorsement is another way. So it does build a sort of an empathy. The trust component builds an empathy. Logic is fairly straightforward. That's just the features and benefits of the product or service. So that's the cognitive proof point of the argument. So that's price, it's location, it's if I'm buying a piece of electronics, it's the features. But really, what we've seen, and the research bears it out, is that you do need to have trust and you do need to build a logical argument. But it's all about the love. It's all about the emotional connection. And as a matter of fact, people will post-rationalize almost all of their decisions based on a feeling that they have. They make the decision based on a feeling, and they most often can't really explain why they make that decision. It's visceral and it's deep and it's emotional. And then they post-rationalize it by saying, oh, but it was the right price at the right time. Oh, but it has all these features and benefits. Oh, it's in the right location. Oh, I recognize that thing, or that's a brand that I'm familiar with. But that's really not why they do it. They do it for, it's because that product or service or thing has driven an emotional response with them, and it's given them joy most of all, or sometimes fear. Fear is another driver. So I don't know. I mean, I've tried to unpack that, and I talked to one of your colleagues at the institute about this,
Yes.
Dr. Nortoff, and he more or less, agreed with me. But and like when you hear that, do you go, "You're out of your mind, Tony"? Or
no? I think that's exactly right. I think that those three are probably the key drivers, and in essence, the emotional hook is really probably the most important driver, because and if somebody like Mark Carney was telling me this, and I have a lot of time and respect for him, and he's a numbers guy, so the facts and the logic is there, but he's saying without that component, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for.
No.
And that's exactly true. And I think, as I was alluding to the American election, I still scratch my head because from the logic point of view, I don't understand. But obviously, it has all to do with the emotion. and somewhere, as disgusting as I find Trump, and you may want to bleep out what you want, but he certainly had a resonance point to the point that people would go down and break down their Capitol building and break into it and be ready to kill for that. To get people to be driven to that point in terms of that thing, what was the logic? And I still don't see the logic in it.
Yeah.
Obviously, what the connection is more like an emotional connection.
I think it is an emotional connection, and it's a good segue, because I wanted to talk about in terms of a driver, and I don't know if you have a scientific opinion, or maybe if you just have an opinion that loosely based in science, in terms of hope versus fear in marketing. Mm-hmm. Now, I've always believed that hope wins over fear, and when I look at successful brands, consumer brands, or even philanthropic brands, or altruistic brands, or purpose-driven brands, they definitely lean into hope more than fear. They're not making you afraid of something. But the neuroscience and neuromarketers actually say that fear is the only driver of behavior. That hope doesn't play into it at all. That there's a thing called the pain, claims, and gain matrix that really feeds into the primal brain, which is the ultimate decision maker. Because it's deeply involved in your emotional state. So I found that interesting, because I don't get how big brands have been so successful with joyful, hopeful messages if fear is the only driver. I don't understand that. So, no. But it's scientifically backed. So I don't want to dispute the science, but yeah.
Absolutely. You look at the commercials for all big pharma. What do you see? You will see joy, you will see family, you will see achievement, you will see love, you'll see sex. And at the same time in the back...
I don't know what commercials you're looking at, Zul. I've never seen that.
Sexy women or sexy men. I mean, and you will see that the subtext that's rambling on in the background has all the dangerous things that a drug does.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Right. But the message that's overarching is of the hope and joy. Mm-hmm. Right. And the bottom text is basically ignored by most people.
Right.
And that's why that formula works for them. Otherwise, all the commercials would not be the same.
And they're all exactly the same.
They're all exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so when it is juxtaposed and emotionally taking you to a place where you would want to be, you're willing to ignore the fear part. Mm-hmm. Now, not everybody is going to react the same way. I mean, it's a bet on getting the majority in, but some people will focus in on those side effects and say, hey, this is not what I want to sign up for. Mm-hmm. If you listen to them, I mean, they're horrible, some of the side effects.
Right.
Yeah. So definitely fear plays in. Fear is a driver, but certainly in some people that, it depends on the individual, because sometimes when you are anxious and when you are scared, your thinking kind of narrows down in terms of a survival mode and become more focused on and more ruminative. And you might pick up those negative tones and stick with them. But most people are not in that state all the time. And I think that the positive hope message has a big impact.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about dopamine, because I do, in terms of hope and joy and decision. Yeah. It's been called the pleasure particle or the pleasure chemical. I think probably mistakenly called that, but everybody every day is exposed to how marketing is trying to elicit a dopamine hit. I call it on your phone, when you look at your phone, all of the colors on your phone, and especially those little red dots that pop up when you have a text or an email.
Yeah.
I like that. I call that the red dot fever, because there is a little hit of dopamine. Oh,
Yes.
somebody's texted me or
Yes.
somebody's contacted me. So, it's a little hit of dopamine each
Yes.
time. And
Yes.
actually, a little test, if you go to if you have an iPhone at least, you can turn the color off on your phone. You can make it into a completely grayscale experience, and it's
Yeah.
amazing how little you'll touch your phone when the color's turned off.
Oh,
You
is that
don't
right?
you don't want to interact with it as much, yeah, because it just doesn't give you that joyful hit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, what can you tell us? Explain a little bit. I know it's obviously pretty complicated. Can you explain a little bit about what dopamine is, how it works, and how it how it
Yes.
influences our decisions?
So the dopamine is dopamine is of course the neurotransmitter in the brain. And when we were talking about the interconnectedness of the brains, I alluded to the fact that these nerve cells talk to each other through their synaptic connections. The synaptic connections, what they are is that one neuron ends and another neuron begins. And how does one neuron talk to the other is when the electrical potential goes down the neuron, it causes the release at the junction between the first nerve cell and the second one, causes the release of chemicals, and these are neurotransmitters. Dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters that carries the message onto the next nerve cell. Okay. Now, the different neuron projections in the brain emanate from different regions of the brain. So, for example, for dopamine, it's an area called the ventral tegmental area. That's where the majority of the cells that actually produce dopamine start. And then they project on, and they project on to many different regions of the brain, but they project on to what we call the limbic areas, like the nucleus accumbens and other areas, which are sort of more in the emotional, positive thinking side of things. And then they also project to the motor area. So a lot of the neurons that, for example, if they die off, you have manifestations such as Parkinson's disease, which is a motor dysfunction. And sometimes you will see that the people who have Parkinson's disease will also have depression because they are not experiencing the hedonic side of things because it's the same transmitter. But dopamine is a transmitter. It's almost like electricity. Okay, so if it comes to your light bulb, it'll light the light bulb. But if it's going to your radio, it'll play music. So by the same token, this dopamine it serves circuits that are that maintain positive valence, positive value, and that is definitely one of the key transmitters that actually contributes to the positive feel you get when you engage in pleasurable activities like jogging or like sex or like eating. All those things evoke the release of dopamine. That's known. That's very clear. And so anything that actually activates that system would evoke pleasurable event. Now, the thing is that it's very true that that's the driver. But the other thing that you need to keep in mind is that if you train an animal, for example, that you're going to give a rat one pellet when he presses the bar, say 5 times, if you measure the release of dopamine, you will see that when he gets the pellet, the dopamine will rise. And then
this is how they discovered dopamine, like in the 50s. Right. This is the Olds and Milner experiments, right?
Exactly. And so, but what happens is that the same behavior and the reward does not always evoke the same amount of dopamine release. The dopamine release will start going down with time. And that is, it is setting the system up for something else that may be more pleasurable, because otherwise you will not look at anything else. Mm-hmm. Right? And so there is a downregulation of the response. If you train another rat, for example, that when he presses the same number of bar presses, he would get, say, 10 pellets, you would see a much bigger rise of dopamine initially, but then it will kind of fall down again. The thing. But eventually, so the first rat, when it went down, if you now suddenly increase his reward from 1 pellet to 2, it'll go back up again. In the other rat, instead of was getting 10 pellets, now you'd have to give him like 20 pellets to get the same amount of increase.
Right.
So it is all relative, and it is all downregulated over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not always the same, is what I'm trying to say, is that it is more there's a more skewed towards something that is highly rewarding, but it doesn't maintain itself at that level of elevation all the time. And so you need that's why people, for example, who get addicted want to go for more and more drugs, because they want trying to achieve that high that they used to get that don't anymore.
Right.
Okay.
So we sort of like talk about that at the agency here in terms of patterns, right? So if you develop a piece of creative, a story, a piece of music, a video, it should have some kind of a pattern that's recognizable to people, so that you will get that kind of a pleasure dopamine hit. But if it doesn't surprise somebody, like, it literally will go in one ear and out the other. So our approach to creativity is that it needs to have some semblance of recognition, which is a pattern, but then you need to break that pattern with some kind of a surprise device, so that the dopamine actually gets released, and then it gets accelerated at the end or in the middle or whenever. And that's why people come back for more. And I've heard that described as in music, that's what an earworm is, because it comes into your head and you recognize the pattern, but then there's some kind of a break in the pattern, like a key change in an odd place or a vocal styling that's different. And that's what makes it memorable. That's why you can't shake it, because your brain can't rationalize the pattern that well. You know? So I find that really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
It is fascinating. And it also sets the tone in the sense that, so we were talking about the release of dopamine in response to a positive event. But the thing is that if you condition an animal, for example, you put a light on just before the reward session begins, then you will see that in that context, the light itself will cause the release of dopamine, even though the light is not actually rewarding to the animal. What it is doing is setting up the expectation that now it's going to lead you to a situation where you're going to get the reward. And so in terms of the marketing, I think that is what people aim for, to kind of increase that expectation of a positive reward that this activity is leading you towards. And so it's almost like priming the system.
Interesting. Yeah. We talked about phones there briefly earlier on. I want to talk a little bit about apps and technology and data in our everyday life.
Yeah.
I kind of think that the tools that we use are making our lives, quote unquote, or air quotes, easier, because we don't have to think about things, because things are automated. I feel like the muscular brain, like that processing power of the brain is getting ignored, and it's being replaced with technology. And I think we're getting dumber. I'm not the only person thinking that. So what evidence would suggest that? I mean, you're a 40-year scientist looking at brain and mind and neuroscience. Like, what evidence would suggest that, our use of technology is not using our brains the way it should be?
Yeah, I don't think that way. I think that, yes, it's true that our young kids may not be able to do the multiplication like we used to memorize those tables and be able to give you the right change. But the technology is enabling them to give you the right change. Is that a bad thing? I don't really think so. I think that their attention and their capacity will be deployed elsewhere, doing other useful things. But really, the use of technology, I think, is incredibly useful. And I'm very much focused in the developing countries where there is such a need for mental health help. I know for a fact that we will, in those countries, will never have enough psychologists or psychiatrists ever to be able to meet the needs. So what we're trying to do in terms of using technology is to enable people to use technology to be able to interact with people in need, and they're sort of empowered through the technology. Let me give an example. Let's go back to Uber, for example. Okay. At one point in time, if you wanted to drive a cab, you needed to know the city inside out. You needed to know the maps at the back of your hand. All of a sudden, here comes Uber, and you don't need to know the city. They will give you a map. They'll tell you where to pick somebody up when. They'll tell you what road to take to drop the person off to the right destination, and what roads to avoid because of the traffic. And it'll even tell them, ask the passenger, how was your drive? And how was the driver? Okay, all this through technology. So all of a sudden, it's become the largest taxi company in the world. They don't own a single cab.
Right.
So the technology can turn things around. So I'm saying, why can't we use technology to enable health workers that are not psychologists or psychiatrists, but will give them some guidance through the technology in their iPhones or on their iPads, and be able to detect when somebody is in distress, whether they're anxious, whether they're depressed, what kind of cognitive therapy to give them, and when to shake hand off to somebody when the need is more than they can provide. So that all of a sudden, now you can give help to people where they want it, where they need it, in those rural areas, because the penetration of the cell phones is enormous. Everybody seems to have a cell phone now in those countries. So we can use technology to provide help and services to people that would otherwise be left high and dry.
Right.
Right. And that's the kind of advantage it brings. Does it mean that because the health worker who's providing support is not that highly educated in psychology or psychiatry that they can't help out? They certainly can. Why don't we enable them like we did the Uber drivers?
That's an interesting way of looking at it for sure. Yeah. Okay. What's next in neuroscience, do you think? Like, what do you think is the, I've heard you use the word, what's the moonshot? Like, what is the next beachhead that scientists need to land on to, get a deeper understanding of the intersection of physiology and mind and sense of self and all of these things?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's a complex question, because the thing is that I think, in my mind, because of my focus on trying to help people in need in terms of mental health or neuroscience, really the end goal in my mind, one of the end goals should be, how can we use our understanding of neuroscience to develop personalized interventions? We know for a fact that antidepressants, for example, more than half the time will not work for individuals. And they will go through trial and error and iteration of this drug versus that drug. Time goes by and they're suffering enormously in silence. And so why can't we find ways of understanding what is the etiology of the malfunction? So at one point, we were looking at malfunctions in the brain as if it was a physical aberration somehow. We're seeing that that's not the case at all in mental illness. What has gone awry is the circuitry and the communication between these thousands of circuits in the brain. So we need to understand those circuits better, what drives what is responsible for what behaviors. And And because I think one of the fascinating things is that the brain is probably the most sensitive organ for the environment. It picks up whatever is going on around you. That's all it does, really. It is picking up signals from the environment and reacting to it, and reacting physiologically to it through neurotransmitters, through interconnectedness, through neuroplasticity, all kinds of ways in which it's dealing with the incoming information from outside to make you cope with the environment the best you can. And so because of this interactedness and huge connections, circuits can go awry for many different reasons. When you look at heart disease, when you have a chest pain, we talked about that, you go to the Heart Institute and they'll try and figure out, is it just a indigestion, or is it a true heart attack? Is it a blocked artery, or is it a valve? Like, what's going on? And you treat it specifically for that thing. Now, because mental illnesses are all due to interconnectedness in the brain, we need to use that information to be able to find out, like, what is causing the symptoms in what individual and why, and can we then go into precision medicine to treat either with drugs or with other kinds of forms of therapy. It doesn't have to be drugs, to correct that aberration that's ongoing.
Right.
I think that is, in my mind, would be a big step forward in understanding. And I often talk about depression as being like a piazza, like a little village in Italy. So many little roads that come to this piazza, and everybody's road journey to that depression is different. And we don't understand right now how and why is it different. And the idea is that, can neuroscience shed more light into our understanding of what pathways are responsible for what kind of aberrations in behavior that we can fix?
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, there's no, you've talked about this before, there's no blood test, right? So, maybe we can look forward to a day with people like yourself and big minds around the world and here in Canada looking at neuroscience and getting to a point where people can get individualized diagnoses and individualized care based on their anxiety or depression or whatever particular illness they have. And that'll be a good day.
Mm-hmm. It will be a good day, and it's an exciting day, because I think that we are beginning to see a lot that's going on in the brain. In the brain used to be like a black box, right? Because you can't open it up to study it very readily, obviously. And through this new imaging technologies and through more complicated MEG technologies or EEGs, we're able to eavesdrop on the functionality of the brain much better, and understanding these little roadways within the brain a lot better, and understanding what some of the pathways are within the brain that should be functioning one way or another. And when the functioning goes awry, that we need to be able to pick up the change in signaling and do something about it very early on. Because if you don't, like, the prognosis becomes worse with time.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Zul, we'll leave it there. It's been a really interesting discussion. I sincerely appreciate your time. You're a busy guy. Zul Merali is the founding director of the Brain and Mind Institute at the Aga Khan University. Has a long career in academia and in mental health. And thanks a lot for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you got some value out of our time together. I know we've barely scratched the surface of this enormous topic, so join us next time, and you know what? Let's flip over some rocks.